The most dangerous men are usually the ones who say thank you after you save their lives. The wind moved low across the Kansas prairie that night, bending the wheat fields like dark water beneath the moonlight. Clara Whitmore stood alone on her porch holding a lantern in one hand and her father's old shotgun in the other, while thunder rolled somewhere beyond Black Canyon. Out in Red Hollow, storms had a way of carrying trouble toward lonely ranches. And Clara had been lonely a very long time. The horses sensed it first. Nervous stomping inside the barn. Sharp breathing. Then silence. Clara narrowed her eyes toward the southern field where the wheat shifted strangely against the wind. Something was moving out there. Something heavy. She stepped down from the porch slowly, boots pressing into damp earth still warm from the day's heat. The lantern glow trembled across the field as she walked nearly 40 yards from the house. Then she saw him. A man lay collapsed between the wheat rows, one arm wrapped tightly around a small figure beside him. For one terrible second, Clara thought it was a child sleeping against his chest. But the stillness said otherwise. The little Apache girl couldn't have been older than 10. Her dark braid rested across the outlaw's coat like spilled ink, unmoving beneath the moonlight. Clara's breath caught in her throat. The man holding her looked half dead himself. Dust covered his black duster coat. Rain streaked his weathered face. One side of his shirt was soaked dark from a wound near his ribs, though he'd wrapped it tightly with torn fabric to slow the bleeding. Yet, even unconscious, his arm remained protectively around the girl as if he'd refused to let the prairie take her alone. Clara knelt carefully beside him. That was when she noticed the folded paper sticking from his coat pocket. A wanted poster. The lantern light flickered across the name, and suddenly the cold night felt 10 degrees colder. Elias Boone. Dead or alive. $10,000. Clara had seen the posters hanging in every rail station from Wichita to Colorado Territory. Some called him a train robber. Others said he'd burned federal payroll wagons and vanished into the mountains with Apache raiders. Mothers warned their sons about him. Sheriffs cursed his name over whiskey. And now the most wanted cowboy in the territory was bleeding in her field with a dead child in his arms. Elias stirred weakly beneath her touch. His gray-blue eyes opened for barely a second before unfocusing again beneath exhaustion. But Clara heard the words he whispered into the cold prairie air. Couldn't save her. Not angry. Not cruel. Just broken. Clara looked down at the girl again. Dust clung to the child's small moccasins. One tiny hand still gripped a silver pendant shaped like a hawk. Something about it tightened painfully inside Clara's chest. Far off in the distance, horses thundered across the plains. Multiple riders. Fast. Hunting riders. Clara stood immediately. Lantern light danced against the shotgun barrel as she looked toward the southern ridge where shadows moved through the storm haze. Bounty hunters. Maybe lawmen. Maybe worse. Another clap of thunder rolled across the prairie while the outlaw beside her struggled to stay conscious. Clara knew exactly what the law expected her to do next. Leave him there. Wait for the riders. Collect the money. Instead, she lowered the shotgun slowly into the wheat. Then she grabbed Elias Boone beneath the shoulders and whispered the one sentence that would change both their lives forever. You'd better not die in my field, cowboy. The storm reached the ranch just as Clara dragged Elias Boone through the barn doors. Rain hammered the roof in steady waves while the horses shifted nervously inside their stalls, rolling their eyes toward the wounded outlaw leaning heavily against her shoulder. He was taller than she realized out in the wheat field, broad enough that every few steps her boots slid sideways through mud beneath their weight. But somehow he kept trying not to collapse entirely onto her. Even half conscious, the man was careful. Barn, he muttered weakly through clenched teeth. Do not bring me inside. Clara shoved the heavy door closed behind them and locked the iron bar into place. You are in no condition to give orders, she said. Lightning flashed through the cracks in the wood walls, illuminating the dried blood on his coat and the exhaustion carved deep into his face. Up close, Elias Boone did not look like the outlaw from the wanted posters. He looked older, tireder, like a man who had spent too many nights sleeping under cold skies with no one waiting for him anywhere. Clara helped him sit against a stack of hay bales while rainwater dripped from the brim of his black hat. The silver pendant from the little Apache girl still hung loosely in his hand. He had not let go of it once. Who was she? Clara asked quietly. Elias looked toward the barn floor for a long moment before answering. Her name was Lila. His voice sounded rough from dust and pain. She was trying to get home. Clara waited for more, but the silence returned immediately. Outside, distant hoofbeats rolled faintly across the prairie. Closer now. Searching. Elias heard them too. His tired eyes lifted toward the barn doors. You should leave me here, he said. Take the reward money. Clara crossed the barn toward the old water pump without answering. She soaked a clean cloth from a nearby bucket and knelt beside him again, carefully wiping dust from the wound near his ribs. Elias flinched once, but never complained. If I wanted $10,000, Clara said softly, I would have married Rich years ago. For the first time since she found him, something almost like amusement touched the corner of his mouth. Small, gone in a second, but real. Clara cleaned the wound carefully beneath the lantern light. The bullet had grazed him rather than gone deep, though the long ride and rain had made everything worse. He had also been running for days. She could see it in the bruised exhaustion beneath his eyes and the dust ground deep into his gloves. Men who traveled hard across territory carried a certain silence with them. Elias carried enough silence for 3 lifetimes. Suddenly the horses shifted sharply again. Clara froze. Lantern shadows flickered across the barn walls while voices drifted faintly from somewhere outside the ranch house. Male voices. 3 riders at least. Elias reached instinctively toward the revolver resting near his coat, but Clara grabbed his wrist before he could move. No. Her green eyes locked onto his beneath the lantern glow. You draw that gun in my barn, they will hear it from half a mile away. Elias stared at her hand gripping his wrist. Then slowly, he released the revolver. Outside, Boots stepped onto the porch boards of the ranch house. Clara's stomach tightened. She recognized one of the voices immediately. Deputy Martin Hale, from Red Hollow. Miss Whitmore, the deputy called through the storm. You awake in there? Clara stood quickly and grabbed the lantern. Elias rose halfway beside the hay bales despite the pain, already preparing himself to disappear back into the storm if necessary. Clara glanced toward him once. Rainwater still dripped from his dark hair. The silver pendant rested against his palm. And for some reason she still could not explain, the most wanted man in the territory looked less dangerous than the men standing outside her door. Stay quiet, she whispered. Then she walked alone into the thunder. Clara opened the ranch house door just enough for the lantern light to spill across the porch. Rain fell in silver sheets behind Deputy Martin Hale and the 2 riders standing beside him. Water dripped steadily from their hats onto the wooden boards while thunder rolled low over the prairie. Hale removed his gloves slowly, studying Clara with tired eyes. Sorry to wake you this late, Miss Whitmore, he said. We are tracking a fugitive through this part of the territory. Clara leaned one shoulder lightly against the doorway, as if she had nothing in the world to fear. Most folks track cattle this time of night. You lawmen always did enjoy harder work. One of the riders gave a dry laugh, but Hale did not smile. His eyes drifted past Clara toward the dark barn behind the ranch house, where lightning flashed faintly against the wood. You seen anybody come through here? He asked. Clara shook her head once. Only thing passing through tonight is the storm. Hale stepped closer beneath the porch roof. Rainwater slid from the brim of his hat, while his voice lowered carefully. Word is Boone crossed Black Canyon 3 days ago. Witnesses say he was traveling with an Apache. Child. At those words, Clara felt something tighten quietly inside her chest. Not fear exactly. Something heavier. She kept her face calm. People say many things after whiskey. Hale studied her another second. Then his gaze settled on a faint streak of mud near her boots. Fresh mud. The kind that came from the southern wheat fields after heavy rain. Clara noticed his eyes linger there. So did he. Silence stretched between them while the storm breathed around the porch. Then one of the horses tied near the barn gave a sudden nervous snort. Hale glanced toward the sound immediately. Clara's pulse slowed dangerously. Mind if we warm ourselves in the barn a minute? He asked. There it was. The moment that separates ordinary nights from the ones people remember forever. Clara folded her arms slowly against the cold. You know my father built that barn before the war? She asked casually. Hale frowned slightly at the strange answer. No, ma'am. Roof leaks something terrible near the east stalls. Clara tilted her head toward the thunder, shaking the prairie. Lightning hit it last spring. Horses get nervous around strangers too. Last thing I need tonight Is one of them kicking through rotten wood and breaking a leg? Hale looked toward the barn again. Rain hammered the ranch roof harder now. Finally, he sighed. Fair enough. Clara nearly let herself breathe again before the younger rider beside Hale spoke up. We heard there is $10,000 on Boone's head. His voice carried the greedy excitement of a man who had never held real money before. That kind of cash changes lives. Clara met his eyes without blinking. So does burying the wrong man. The rider shifted awkwardly beneath her stare, while Hale watched her more carefully than before. He had known Clara Whitmore nearly 7 years. Long enough to understand she only spoke that quietly when she meant every word. Another flash of lightning split across the prairie. Then somewhere behind the barn came a low metallic sound. Small, quick, but enough. Hale's hand moved toward his holster immediately. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. Inside the barn, Elias must have knocked something over trying to move. The younger riders straightened instantly. Horses shifted against the fence rails. Rain hissed through the darkness while everyone listened. Another silence followed. Heavy this time. Dangerous. Hale stepped slowly off the porch toward the barn. Clara moved before thinking. Deputy. He stopped halfway across the mud. You remember my brother Samuel? She asked softly. Hale turned back toward her. The mention of Samuel Whitmore always changed people. Samuel had died wearing Union blue 16 years earlier, and half the territory still remembered the funeral procession through Red Hollow. Course I remember him, Hale said carefully. Clara swallowed once before speaking again. Then remember this too. My family buried enough men already. I do not intend to watch another one die in my barn tonight. The storm went silent for one impossible second after she said it. Hale stared at her beneath the rain. Then slowly his eyes drifted toward the dark barn one last time. And something inside the deputy's face changed. Deputy Martin Hale stood motionless in the rain while thunder drifted farther east across the prairie. Water ran from the edge of his coat as he studied Clara Whitmore beneath the porch lantern glow. The younger riders behind him exchanged uncertain looks, waiting for orders that suddenly did not seem as simple anymore. Clara remained perfectly still. She had learned long ago that fear moved too quickly. Calm survived longer in the West. Hale finally removed his hand from near his holster and exhaled slowly through his nose. You always did make hard situations sound heavier than they are, he muttered. Clara gave the faintest shrug. Maybe because hard situations usually bury people if they are ignored. One of the younger deputies shifted impatiently beside the porch rail. Sir, we cannot just leave if Boone is in there. Hale glanced toward him sharply enough to silence the complaint. Then he looked back at Clara again. You see anything strange tomorrow morning, he said carefully. You ride into town immediately. Clara nodded once. Hale held her gaze another second before stepping backward into the ring. Mount up, he ordered quietly. The riders turned their horses away from the ranch while the storm swallowed the sound of hoofbeats inch by inch across the dark prairie. Clara stayed on the porch until the lantern light could no longer catch their outlines through the rain. Only then did she finally breathe fully again. The barn remained silent behind her. Too silent. She grabbed the lantern and crossed the muddy yard quickly while cold wind twisted through the wheat fields around the ranch house. Inside the barn, the horses calmed the moment she entered, but Elias Boone was no longer sitting beside the hay bales where she left him. Clara's heart stumbled hard against her ribs. The lantern glow swept across empty stalls, hanging tack, drifting dust. Then she saw him near the far wall, one hand braced against the wood beams while he struggled to stay standing. He had moved closer to the back exit of the barn, preparing to leave. Rainwater leaked through the roof above him, dripping steadily onto the floorboards. Clara set the lantern down harder than intended. You should not even be walking. Elias kept his eyes toward the storm outside the narrow barn window. Could not let them find you helping me. His voice sounded weaker now, worn thin by exhaustion. Clara crossed the barn toward him. And walking into a thunderstorm with a bullet wound sounded smarter? Elias gave a tired half-smile that never fully reached his face. It has been my experience that smart decisions rarely keep a man alive out here. Clara noticed then that he still carried the silver hawk pendant in his hand. His fingers tightened around it unconsciously whenever he drifted too deep into thought. Deputy Hale knew somebody was here, she said quietly. He left anyway. Elias lowered his eyes toward the dirt floor. Martin Hale used to ride federal routes before the war. Clara blinked slightly. You know him? Everybody knew Martin Hale once. Elias leaned carefully against the wall beam as thunder rolled again across the plains. Back then he believed laws protected people. The faint bitterness in his voice settled heavily inside the barn. Clara studied him in silence. Most outlaws she had ever heard about blamed the world, loudly for what they became. Elias Boone spoke like a man too tired to blame anybody anymore. Outside, the storm slowly weakened into steady rain. Somewhere near the house, the wind chimes beneath the porch roof rattled softly against each other. Elias closed his eyes briefly at the sound, almost like he was remembering something distant. My mother had wind chimes, he said suddenly. Clara looked surprised. Elias opened his eyes again, seeming almost surprised he had spoken aloud at all. Kansas Territory, he continued quietly. Small ranch north of Abilene. She said the sound kept lonely spirits moving instead of settling. Clara rested one hand against the rough wooden stall beside her. Did it work? A long silence followed. Then Elias looked toward the rain beyond the barn window and answered with painful honesty. No, ma'am. Some things stay with a man anyway. The lantern flickered softly between them while rain whispered across the prairie roof overhead. And for the first time since Clara found him bleeding in her wheat field, the outlaw standing before her no longer looked like a wanted legend from a poster. He looked like someone who had been carrying ghosts farther than any horse could ride. Morning arrived slowly over Red Hollow. Pale sunlight stretched across the prairie grass while mist drifted low over Clara Whitmore's ranch like smoke refusing to leave after a fire. The storm had passed during the night, but the earth still smelled of rain and wet cedar wood. Clara stood at the kitchen stove pouring coffee into 2 tin cups while the old clock above the sink ticked softly through the silence. Outside the window, she could see Elias sitting alone near the horse trough beside the barn. He had cleaned himself sometime before sunrise. The black duster coat now hung over the fence rail drying beneath the morning light, and fresh bandages wrapped carefully around his ribs beneath a plain gray shirt she found in her father's old trunk. Yet despite the cleaner clothes and daylight around him, he still looked like a man passing through rather than belonging anywhere. Clara carried both coffee cups outside. The porch boards creaked gently beneath her boots, while meadowlarks sang somewhere beyond the wheat fields. Elias glanced up only when she stepped near him. You should still be resting, she said. He accepted the coffee carefully with one hand. Been resting too long already. His voice remained quiet, rough like gravel softened by rain. Clara leaned against the fence beside him while steam drifted upward from their cups into the cool morning air. For a while neither spoke. Out on the prairie, silence had its own language. Then Clara noticed something strange near the horse trough. Elias had washed the silver hawk pendant during the night. Sunlight now reflected softly across the polished metal hanging from his fingers. Tiny markings circled the edges of the pendant. Not decoration. Words. Clara narrowed her eyes slightly. What does it say? Elias looked down at the pendant a long moment before answering. Apache. You can read it? A faint smile touched his face again. Small enough most people would miss it. Enough to get myself into trouble. Clara took another sip of coffee while the morning breeze lifted loose strands of her chestnut hair across her face. People in town say you robbed federal payroll trains all across New Mexico territory. Elias stared toward the distant hills. People in town also say thunder means God is angry. Clara watched him carefully. So you did not rob them? Elias rubbed one thumb slowly across the edge of the pendant. Depends who was writing the reports. The answer settled between them with dangerous weight. Clara realized then that Elias Boone never actually denied the things written about him. He simply spoke like truth had become too tangled to explain cleanly anymore. A horse suddenly approached the fence from the far paddock, a large gray mare with a scar along her neck from an old rope burn. Clara expected the animal to shy away from the stranger. Instead, the mare lowered her head directly toward Elias. He reached out slowly, letting the horse smell his hand first before gently brushing her mane aside. Calm, patient, like someone handling something fragile. Clara studied him quietly while sunlight moved across the ranch yard. Most dangerous men I ever met, she said softly, usually liked hearing themselves talk. Elias kept his attention on the horse. Talking gets people noticed, and being noticed gets people killed. His hand paused briefly against the mare's neck. Then he nodded once. The answer carried no drama, no self-pity, just experience. Clara suddenly understood why loneliness seemed to follow him like dust behind a rider. Before she could speak again, Elias slowly reached into the inside pocket of his coat hanging nearby and removed something folded carefully in oilcloth. A newspaper clipping. He handed it toward her without explanation. Clara unfolded the paper carefully. Her breath caught immediately. The article showed a burned wagon train near Black Canyon with the headline "Federal Marshal Killed During Apache Raid." Beneath the headline sat a photograph she recognized instantly. Elias Boone, but younger, clean-shaven, wearing a marshal's badge. Clara looked up sharply. Elias watched the prairie instead of her. "That was before they changed my name in the papers," he said quietly. The morning wind moved softly through the wheat fields around them, while somewhere far off a train whistle echoed across the territory. And for the first time since he arrived at her ranch, Clara Whitmore realized the outlaw beside her had not always been running from the law. Once upon a time, he had worn it. The newspaper clipping remained on Clara Whitmore's kitchen table long after the coffee turned cold. Sunlight drifted slowly across the faded photograph, while dust floated through the quiet ranch house, like tiny pieces of memory refusing to settle. Clara sat near the window reading the article for the third time, but the words still felt impossible beside the man standing outside her barn. Federal Marshal Elias Boone killed during Apache raid. Hero officer lost near Black Canyon. Clara lifted her eyes toward the yard where Elias repaired a loose fence rail with careful movements despite the bandages beneath his shirt. Every motion looked practiced, disciplined. Nothing about him resembled the outlaw stories whispered through saloons across Kansas territory. Yet something else troubled her more than the newspaper itself. The date. The article had been printed 6 years earlier. 6 years between the dead marshal in the clipping and the wanted man standing beside her barn now. 6 years where somebody had turned a lawman into the most hunted rider in the territory. Clara folded the newspaper slowly just as Elias stepped onto the porch outside. He paused near the doorway like a man uncertain whether he belonged inside another person's home. "You always stand there before entering?" Clara asked quietly. Elias removed his hat, turning it once through his hands. "Habit." Clara leaned back in her chair slightly. "You afraid of crossing thresholds?" A faint shadow crossed his expression. Sometimes doors close behind people. The answer lingered heavily between them. Clara gestured toward the empty chair across from her table. Elias hesitated before finally sitting down carefully, every movement measured from old injuries and older caution. Wind brushed softly against the kitchen curtains while somewhere outside the horses shifted lazily beneath the warming afternoon sun. Clara placed the folded newspaper between them. "You were a marshal." Elias nodded once. "Long time ago. And now there is $10,000 on your head." His eyes settled on the table rather than her face. Closer to 15 by now probably. Clara studied him another moment before speaking carefully. "What happened at Black Canyon?" Silence answered first. Deep silence. The kind built from years spent carrying truths too dangerous to say aloud. Elias rubbed his thumb slowly against the edge of his tin coffee cup. Finally he spoke. "You ever notice how newspapers only print stories after somebody important decides what version sounds cleaner?" Clara remained still. Elias looked toward the kitchen window where sunlight stretched golden across the wheat fields. "Black Canyon was not a raid," he said quietly. "It was a transfer." Clara frowned slightly. "Transfer of what?" Elias met her eyes then, and for the first time since arriving at her ranch, something colder moved beneath his calm expression. "Children." The single word settled over the kitchen like thunder rolling across distant plains. Clara felt her breath catch softly. Elias leaned back slowly in the chair, exhaustion lining his face deeper than before. Federal wagons were moving Apache and Comanche children south through Canyon territory. Official reports called it relocation. His jaw tightened briefly. Most of those children never reached the camps they were listed for. Clara stared at him in silence. Outside, wind stirred the porch chimes again with a lonely metallic song. Elias continued carefully, each word measured. "I found out some men were selling them instead. Railroad money. Trading posts. Wealthy buyers back east." Clara lowered her eyes toward the table. Suddenly the stories about train robberies and missing payroll wagons no longer sounded quite the same. "You tried stopping them." Elias gave a faint, humorless smile. Tried reporting it first. The kitchen fell quiet again. Clara understood now why he spoke like a man carrying ghosts. Some truths buried people deeper than graves ever could. After a long moment, she asked softly, "And the little girl? Lila?" Elias looked down at the silver pendant resting near his hand. "Last witness." The words nearly disappeared beneath the wind outside. Clara watched his fingers tighten carefully around the pendant again. Not angry, not bitter, just tired in a way she had never seen another person before. Then suddenly a distant sound rolled faintly across the prairie. Hoofbeats. Fast. More than one rider this time. Elias heard it immediately. His eyes lifted toward the window while every quiet part of him changed at once. The tired man sitting at Clara's table vanished beneath something sharper. Older. Survival returning like instinct. Clara turned toward the ranch yard just as 3 riders appeared along the southern ridge through drifting dust and afternoon light. And even from half a mile away, Elias Boone recognized the man leading them. The 3 riders came down the southern ridge slowly, their horses cutting long shadows across the prairie grass beneath the falling afternoon sun. Dust rolled behind them in soft clouds while heat shimmered over the open land between the ranch and the distant hills. Clara Whitmore stood near the kitchen window, watching them approach, but Elias Boone had already gone still beside the table. Completely still. The kind of stillness only dangerous memories create. He did not reach for his revolver. That was what unsettled Clara most. Men usually reached for weapons when trouble arrived. Elias simply watched. Quiet. Focused. Like a man counting ghosts returning home. "You know them," Clara said softly. Elias kept his eyes toward the riders. Only the one in front. The lead rider wore a dark brown coat despite the heat, with silver spurs flashing beneath the sunlight each time his horse stepped forward. Even from a distance, there was something polished about him that did not belong out on the frontier. Too clean. Too controlled. Clara noticed Elias's jaw tighten slightly the moment the man lifted his head toward the ranch house. "Who is he?" she asked. Elias answered without looking away. "Nathan Crowley." The name carried weight. Clara could hear it in his voice immediately. Not fear. Something colder than fear. The riders stopped roughly 50 yards from the ranch fence. Wind drifted through the wheat fields while somewhere above them a hawk circled slowly against the pale sky. Crowley dismounted first. Tall, gray at the temples, calm in the way wealthy men often looked calm because somebody else usually suffered consequences for them. The 2 men beside him remained on horseback, watching the ranch carefully. Crowley removed his gloves 1 finger at a time before speaking. "It has been a long ride, Marshal Boone." The old title landed across the ranch yard like a challenge. Clara glanced toward Elias, but his expression never changed. "You rode all this way for nostalgia?" Elias asked quietly. Crowley smiled faintly. "I rode all this way because dead men should stay buried." A long silence followed. Wind rattled the porch chimes softly behind Clara while the horses shifted near the fence rails. Crowley's eyes finally moved toward her. Sharp eyes. Measuring eyes. "Miss Whitmore," he said politely, tipping his hat slightly. "I apologize for bringing unpleasant business to your property." Clara folded her arms slowly. "Funny. Most unpleasant business usually arrives. Carrying guns and expensive boots." One of the riders behind Crowley muttered something under his breath, but Crowley lifted one hand gently to quiet him. He kept his attention on Clara instead. "You seem intelligent enough to understand that some men create storms wherever they go." Clara felt Elias move slightly beside her, but he remained silent. Crowley continued calmly. "The man standing beside you has spent 6 years robbing federal shipments, burning records, and murdering officers of the law." "No," Elias said softly. Crowley looked back toward him. "No." Elias stepped forward into the sunlight now, shoulders squared despite the healing wound beneath his shirt. "I spent 6 years trying to stop men like you from selling children across state lines." The ranch yard went silent. Even the wind seemed to pause. Crowley's smile faded slowly, though only around the edges. "Careful," he said. "Truth sounds dangerous coming from fugitives." Clara watched the 2 men carefully. One looked like civilization polished clean for public photographs. The other looked like every mile of the frontier had carved pieces out of him and left only what refused to die. Yet somehow she trusted the outlaw more. Crowley sighed softly, almost disappointed. "You should have stayed hidden, Elias." The use of his first name changed something in the air immediately. Clara noticed it. So did Elias. This was not merely a hunter tracking prey. These men knew each other deeply. Lila died because she trusted your men, Elias said quietly. Crowley's eyes darkened for the first time. The girl was unfortunate. Clara felt her stomach turn cold at the casualness in his voice. Elias looked down briefly at the silver hawk pendant still hanging from his hand. When he lifted his eyes again, something inside them had hardened completely. She was 10 years old. The words came low and steady, more painful than anger. Crowley brushed invisible dust from his sleeve. Children disappear every day in this country, Marshall. Railroads do not stop for tragedies. Clara suddenly understood everything at once. The trains, the missing records, the wanted posters. Elias Boone had not become an outlaw because he loved breaking laws. He became one because the wrong men were writing them. Then Crowley reached slowly inside his coat and removed a folded piece of paper. He held it toward Clara without taking his eyes off Elias. You should read this before deciding who deserves your sympathy. Clara stepped forward carefully and unfolded the paper beneath the fading sunlight. The moment she saw the federal seal at the bottom, her pulse stopped cold. Clara Whitmore held the folded federal document carefully while the prairie wind moved through the ranch yard around them. The paper felt heavier than it should have. Official papers often did. They carried the weight of men who believed stamps and signatures could decide which truths survived history. Nathan Crowley watched her calmly from beside his horse, his polished boots untouched by dust despite standing in the middle of Kansas territory. Elias Boone remained silent near the porch steps, but Clara could feel the tension inside him the way people feel thunder before lightning arrives. She lowered her eyes toward the document. The federal seal rested bright against the page beneath the afternoon sun. Warrant of execution. Clara's breath slowed. Below the seal sat Elias Boone's full name followed by a list of charges stretching nearly half the page. Treason against the territory. Theft of federal property. Destruction of military records. Harboring enemy tribes. Clara felt the air leave her lungs quietly. Then she reached the final paragraph. Federal Marshal Elias Boone is to be considered armed, dangerous, and responsible for the disappearance of 17 children under Government Relocation Authority. The ranch yard seemed to disappear around her for one terrible second. 17 children. Clara slowly lifted her eyes toward Elias. He did not defend himself immediately. That frightened her more than if he had shouted. Crowley took one measured step closer through the prairie grass. You understand now, he said softly. Men like Boone survive by making themselves look tragic. Clara stared at the paper again while wind rustled through the wheat fields behind the ranch. 17 missing children. The words echoed heavily inside her chest. Finally, she looked toward Elias. Tell me the truth. His gray-blue eyes met hers at last. Tired eyes. Honest eyes. The kind that looked like they had forgotten how to lie cleanly a long time ago. I moved them, he said quietly. Crowley smiled faintly beside his horse. But Elias continued before the man could speak. I moved them because your government planned to sell them. Silence crashed across the yard harder than thunder. Clara looked between the two men while the wind chimes beneath her porch rattled softly against each other. Elias stepped forward slowly now, sunlight catching the scar across his brow. Those 17 children disappeared because I took them north through Black Canyon and hid them on tribal land before Crowley's men reached the trains. Crowley's expression hardened slightly. Interesting story. Elias ignored him completely. His attention remained on Clara alone. Lila was one of them. Clara tightened her grip on the paper. Then why are there reports saying officers died? Elias looked away briefly toward the open prairie. Because some men protecting those children never made it home afterward. The answer came low and heavy with memory. Crowley let out a quiet laugh without warmth. And there it is. The outlaw finally turning himself into a hero. But Clara noticed something Crowley did not expect her to notice. Elias never once called himself heroic. He spoke like a man carrying debt, not pride. Suddenly, one of the riders behind Crowley shifted uneasily in the saddle. Older than the others. Nervous. His eyes avoided Elias completely. Clara saw it immediately. Guilt. Crowley noticed too. His calm smile faded for half a second before returning. Enough of this, he said firmly. Miss Whitmore, federal business does not belong on your ranch. Hand Boone over peacefully, and this ends quietly for everyone. Clara looked down again at the execution warrant in her hands. The paper trembled slightly in the wind. Then something caught her eye near the bottom corner. A signature. Deputy Marshal Nathan Crowley. Clara's stomach tightened instantly. She lifted her eyes slowly toward the wealthy rider standing before her. You signed this yourself. Crowley remained calm. I authorized it. Clara understood then. Not just part of it. All of it. The trains. The children. The reports. The wanted posters. Nathan Crowley had not been chasing Elias Boone to deliver justice. He had been chasing the only witness who survived long enough to expose him. The older rider behind Crowley suddenly swallowed hard and looked away toward the prairie horizon. Elias noticed it too. Tell her about Red Creek, Elias said quietly toward the nervous rider. The man's face lost color immediately. Crowley turned sharply toward him. Do not. But the older rider already looked broken beneath years of silence. His voice came rough and low. There were children on those trains. The wind stopped moving for one strange moment across the ranch. Crowley's hand tightened slowly near his coat, while Clara felt her heartbeat echo inside her chest. Then Elias Boone stepped forward once more into the fading sunlight and spoke the sentence Crowley feared more than bullets. There are still survivors alive to testify. The prairie had gone completely silent by the time the older rider lowered his eyes and admitted the truth. No wind. No birds. Only the distant creaking of Clara Whitmore's porch swing moving gently beneath the fading evening light. Nathan Crowley stood motionless near the ranch fence, but the calm polish that once covered him had finally cracked around the edges. Men like Crowley survived because people feared them, but fear weakens the moment truth begins breathing out loud. Elias Boone remained near the porch steps, one hand resting loosely against the railing while the silver hawk pendant turned slowly between his fingers. Clara looked at him differently now, not as the outlaw from the wanted posters, not even as the wounded stranger she dragged from her wheat field. She looked at him as a man who had spent 6 years carrying the weight of children nobody else tried to save. The older rider finally removed his hat with trembling hands. There were 21 children total, he admitted quietly. Boone only got 17 out before the trains reached Red Creek. Crowley's face darkened. Instantly. Careful. But the rider looked exhausted now, like a man tired of sleeping beside ghosts. The reports were lies, he continued. The children were never headed to relocation camps. Clara felt cold move slowly through her chest despite the warm Kansas air. Crowley glanced toward the 2 riders beside him, measuring loyalty the way rich men measure losses. Then his eyes returned to Elias again. You could have disappeared years ago, he said quietly, but instead you kept digging. Elias looked toward the open prairie beyond the ranch. Golden sunlight stretched endlessly across the wheat fields while the evening breeze finally returned soft against the grass. Children deserve graves with names, he answered. And survivors deserve to stop hiding. The words settled heavily across the ranch yard. Crowley let out a slow breath through his nose before giving a small nod to himself. Almost disappointed. You always did mistake stubbornness for honor. Then suddenly the distant sound of riders echoed across the plains again. Not 3 this time. Many. Clara turned sharply toward the northern ridge where dust clouds rolled beneath the sunset. Horses. At least 20. Crowley noticed them too. His confidence faded for the first time all afternoon. The older rider beside him swallowed hard. Elias did not move at all. He simply watched the horizon quietly as the approaching riders grew clearer beneath the dying light. Federal marshals. Real ones this time. Leading them at the front rode Deputy Martin Hale, the same tired lawman who stood on Clara's porch during the storm. Hale pulled his horse to a stop near the ranch fence and removed a folded telegram from inside his coat. Washington finally answered the wires, he announced calmly. Turns out some people back east became very interested once surviving witnesses started talking. Crowley's jaw tightened. You have no authority here. Hale handed the telegram directly toward Clara instead. She unfolded it slowly beneath the sunset glow. Federal investigation authorized into missing children transports through Black Canyon. All warrants against Elias Boone temporarily suspended pending testimony. Clara lifted her eyes slowly toward Elias. He did not smile. He only closed his eyes briefly, like a man finally setting down something unbearably heavy after carrying it too far alone. Crowley looked around the ranch one last time. The federal riders. the frightened silence of his own men, the truth escaping beyond his control. Then, without another word, he mounted his horse and turned toward the southern plains. No dramatic threats, no final speeches. Men like Nathan Crowley always left quietly once the world stopped believing them. Dust swallowed him slowly beneath the horizon until only sunset remained behind him. The ranch grew still again afterward. Deputy Hale tipped his hat respectfully toward Elias before guiding the other marshals away from the property. Soon only Clara and Elias remained standing beneath the fading gold sky. For a long moment neither spoke. Wind moved softly through the wheat fields while the porch chimes sang their lonely little song beside the house. Finally Clara stepped closer to him. "So what happens now?" Elias looked out across the endless prairie. Honestly, he gave the faintest tired smile. "I never planned this far ahead." Clara laughed softly before she could stop herself. The sound surprised both of them. Elias stared at her a moment longer than necessary, like he had almost forgotten gentle things still existed in the world. Then slowly, carefully, he placed the silver hawk pendant into her hand. "Lila said good people should keep pieces of hope close to their hearts," he said quietly. Clara closed her fingers around the pendant while evening light settled warm across the ranch porch behind them. "Then maybe you should stay long enough to learn she was right." Elias looked at her then, truly looked at her. The lonely ranch woman who chose compassion over money. The woman who opened her door when the entire territory would have shut theirs. Somewhere out beyond the plains, the last sunlight disappeared behind Black Canyon. But for the first time in many years, Elias Boone did not feel like a man still running toward darkness. And standing there beside Clara Whitmore, with prairie wind moving softly through the wheat and the sound of home settling quietly around him, he realized some people do not save your life by pulling you from danger. Some save you simply by reminding you that you are still worth coming back for.